The situation in the UK for politics is a little, I think dire is the correct word at the moment. For the last 15 odd years, we've had the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party have changed quite a few times in that time. Not hugely, but enough that they've sort of been just fresh enough to keep getting votes. And in 2019, they had one of the most successful successful for Conservative elections in decades, with Boris Johnson winning areas that had been historically red for like 50 years. Very impressive stuff. And it was on the back of, we are going to actually get Brexit done. People were somewhat inspired by Boris. And despite the fact that Boris was more disappointing than we had hoped, I think he was better than the average politician these days. So I kind of preferred him over that. What the situation is now, unfortunately, is that after Boris Johnson was ousted for being, yes, a massive hypocrite on COVID and being found to have organized gatherings with other politicians in opposition to his own COVID rules, breaking his own COVID rules to have these parties. Not good, hypocritical. But I still argue that it wasn't enough to get rid of him because there wasn't anyone to replace him. Because he's, for all his faults, charismatic and says a lot of the right things, and some of his policies are actually helpful. And they did get rid of him and replaced him with first Liz Truss, who lasted less time than lettuce. Although I think largely she was sabotaged, but perhaps she was also a bad idea anyway. And then she was replaced with Rishi Sunak, who has been nothing in particular, really. I've seen a few little glints of perhaps maybe he has good intentions, perhaps maybe he wants to implement good policies, but I don't know. I don't think there's much to like there. I think I would prefer Boris to Rishi anyway. So that's the current situation. And in light of that situation, Labour are currently looking at, by some metrics, an even bigger victory over the Conservatives than the Conservatives had in 2019, where Labour is looking at potentially filling the entire nation as red as a US state, with just a few little areas of Conservative voting left. Which is a bit concerning, because their leader, Keir Starmer, is, as far as I can tell, pretty much as nothing as Rishi Sunak is. He's just sort of an empty suit neo-lib with some slightly socialist leanings. It's not great. I have heard, though, that he's actually saying we will do something about immigration. And, maybe they will. I don't know. It's been 15 years of Conservatives and they haven't done anything about immigration. I think at this point, the British public, even the ones who would have voted Conservative, even the ones who are right-wing and want something Conservative to be done, are sick of the Conservative Party themselves not doing it. Now, I don't recommend Labour, but I do understand that sentiment. So that's the situation that we're in. And we don't really have a Trump-like figure like the US does. You're very fortunate to have Trump. The closest you could say that we have here is Farage, but there are a lot of problems there. And I've heard more and more people these days saying that he could be controlled opposition. I don't suspect he is, but I don't suspect he's not as good as Trump. He has his problems. He probably is still the best prominent option that I know of. But also I don't think he wants to be Prime Minister. So it's a little bit of a dire situation. What may end up happening here is that, along with my general opinion here, that the US is more volatile, better good times but worse bad times, and more rapid oscillation between them, that the US is sort of a more flat curve. So UK is a more flat curve, where you'll have less good times but less bad times, and slower movements between them. Now, we had Brexit first. It was sort of the first fire across the bow of the culture war. And the US very soon after had Trump. It may be that the more rapid oscillations the US has been having between Trump to Biden, with the militarization and all this radical stuff, that the UK is simply going through that same process slower. And that we are going to end up with 5 years of Labour where most likely they won't do anything good. But then through that, just like in the US with Biden being in charge, through that 5 years of Labour, the people will learn, okay, this is what we actually need. And someone new and better will rise up to replace Labour in light of that clearly insufficient rulership that they have. So that may be what will happen. It's not a great situation either way. And I have a lot more hope for the US right now than for the UK. We will see. Perhaps what I would say is the main benefits of the UK versus the US political layout is the US has more sort of necessary compartments to it. It's got the because it defends explicit rights it has to have a Supreme Court to read that. And it also has, Congress of the two houses, similar to our two houses here. But then you've also got the presidential position, which is an additional thing, which is similar to a king, but not quite the same. Whereas here, the monarch doesn't really take part in politics, so that's basically a non-entity. The Lords barely differs from Commons, so that's basically a non-entity. And so you just have the Commons. That's pretty much where all politics happens. And the main thing I would say is differentiating UK and US politics in a way that describes them as being useful is the US has more rules to protect people, but the UK one is just simpler. It's just simpler, not in terms of the minutiae, but in terms of the general structure of what actually affects politics. The UK is just simpler. And perhaps we need to go towards in that direction. That said, I do advocate for multiple lines of accountability. So perhaps having the Lords is a good idea. So I'm not saying get rid of that, but probably get rid of just loads of extra layers of complexity that are involved in the UK government. And I think getting rid of that Supreme Court that was added in the 90s here is also a good idea. Yeah, removing the Supreme Court is a pretty easy one because that's not part of our system. The benefit of the UK system is that you just have one representative per region, and then they go into one place, the leader is picked from among them, and then everything happens there. That's what I think is the best I can say about the system, is it's really simple and direct and easy to understand. Of course, there's loads of minutiae and complexity around and underneath that is not easy to understand, but at least in the basic form, that's how it works. And simplicity is an advantage because it's more transparent, people can comprehend it better. But yeah, I think you come up with a system which is an improvement of our current system, plays to its strengths while removing some of its weaknesses. Wipe clean Blair's entire legacy. I mean, it seems like probably that is the right idea, yeah. Whereas the fundamental difference between the US republicanism and parliamentary system is bottom up because system's top down. Sort of, it's not that strongly the case. If you have, say, a authoritarian system like a fascism or a socialism, that will be literally top down, almost completely. But even most historical monarchies are not completely top down. There is influence from the bottom up to the king. The king is ultimately the dictator, but with influence from below. The parliamentary democracy and the US Republican system are both more so bottom up than top down compared to the entire range of political styles. The UK system is a little bit more towards top down, but I don't think very much. The fact that you guys can just elect an executive from who can be anyone, that is nice. And I think something like that for the UK might be a good idea. But as I say, each of our nations should play to their strengths. I think the simpler system, which is a bit easier to understand and moves slower, so is less volatile, is the way I would describe the strengths of the British system.